Thank you so much for listening to all 8 episodes of season 1 of Tea with My Uncle Irohs. It's been a lot of fun, a lot of work to put this podcast together, but it's been worth it. Thanks to your support. If you'd like to help me out and support me with my music, check out my Patreon, which I'll link. It's just patreon.com/sonofpaper. Lastly, my guest today, very special for the finale, is Professor Watanabe. And he has a book that we talk a little bit about called Flowering Tale. So check it out. I'll be linking everything below. Peace. Welcome to Tea with My Uncle Irohs. Lazy Susan style conversations with mentors and musicians that have inspired me over the years. I'm your host, Son of Paper. Uncle Iroh is a character in Avatar who my generation has deemed the most wise and patient mentor ever. And so this season, I sat down with my uncles and aunties to pick their brains on how to best navigate this planet with wisdom, grace, and compassion. And what better beverage for conversation than tea? All right, welcome to today's episode, the season finale episode, actually, of Tea with My Uncle Irohs. I'm really lucky to have a really inspiring and one of the most influential teachers I had during my time at Wesleyan, Professor Watanabe. Welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me to participate. I feel very honored that I get to talk to you as part of this season finale. I am Takeshi Watanabe. I've been teaching at Wesleyan for about, maybe now 5-6 years or so, I guess. I've been actually teaching there much longer as a visiting professor. My main area of research and scholarship is actually pre-modern Japanese literature. But as Kyle knows, I teach a lot of different things at Wesleyan. This semester, for example, I'm teaching Foundations of East Asia and trying to teach Korean history a little bit and also Chinese and Japanese. It's a newer course for me. And also I teach, many of you may know, or it's one of my more popular courses, which is on Japanese history through food.
Let's take it back to when we first met. We probably bumped into each other freshman year when I was a freshman back in 2016. But I think our main introduction was during pro seminar in my sophomore spring. So what do you remember from that time? Any initial impressions, just about that class dynamic as a whole? Yeah, take us back to that time.
I could tell you had a lot of different interests, right? And I think in your papers, you were really creative and you wanted to also work with issues that were of concern to you. And as I was alluding to before, I think you were always very invested in Asian American issues. And, I think you were interested in Asian masculinity, and you expressed, I believe, some issues in the past about relationships and having, and maybe, we've all, experienced growing up as Asian American men and in the United States, and it's not necessarily an easy environment, right? And I think I felt very fortunate that you felt comfortable enough with me to talk about that and to be your conversation partner about issues that really matter to you.
I think that was a very memorable class, as well as your samurai class, which I took
Yeah? I wouldn't have thought that so much. The samurai class. I think I interrupted you, but I thought you kind of had always a bemused look on your face.
Well, okay. Not that the entire course and the group of people was necessarily the most productive to really dive deep. The reason why pro seminar and samurai really stick out in my memory is because there are moments with other students that came up, questions during homework that are just emblazed into my memory.
Oh, really? I'm curious about some of those moments. What maybe in either class? What was one moment that you remember?
Sure. Well, I'll start with pro seminar. I'll leave it anonymous just in case anyone's feels like their privacy is infringed. Yeah. But there was a student who was white.
Mhm.
And we were looking at World War II, talking about the way that the U.S. was kind of using propaganda to kind of emasculate Asian American or Asian men, rather Japanese men, in the military. The way that this other student was interpreting that and trying to apply it to their own life felt problematic to me.
Mhm.
So I kind of brought it up in class, and or also on the Google Doc commenting
Right, the
system.
class forum, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
where we all post our responses to the readings, right? Yeah.
right. And it was so interesting being, we were the only two Asian American men in that room.
Mhm.
And so it's not like, there's in no sense where we're trying to battle, but we're more trying to like give each other context of how we approach material. And that was kind of like a very clear example of how different worlds that we were entering from. Opinions can clash and things got a little ugly, but it was, to me, it was very hilarious overall. And I hope that I don't think there was any harm or foul.
I tend not to like confrontation, actually, and I also want to value everybody's views, right? And even if they're incorrect or wrong or problematic, I don't want to censor people either, right? And that because if they censor themselves, then there's no way to really engage in conversation or debate or present different points of view. And Wesleyan too, we can talk a little bit about it, has a certain kind of way in which, again, it's very liberal, but sometimes political issues aren't easy to talk about at Wesleyan, and people can be hurt very easily, and some people are very sensitive. It's easy to get offended, right? And then to shut down conversations. So I'm really glad that you were able to speak up, and it's not necessarily the case that anything gets really resolved in one moment, but it's a culmination of these moments, right? I think that not everybody, but I hope gives people some insight and maybe challenges people's points of views. Korean and Japanese are perhaps the most similar languages that exist today on the planet, but they are very different. And there are some sounds in Korean that I'm just having a real trouble kind of like distinguishing.
I've also noticed that Japanese and Korean are pretty similar. Just trying to listen to a song where there's kind of like tones or things that could alter the way it sounds. Right. Those are kind of stripped away. And then you listen to a song, you're like, wait, that they use a lot of just the same English loan words. They might even borrow the same word, maybe from Chinese. It's very confusing.
Unfortunately, there is that shared history in the 20th century. So there was a time when Japan colonized Korea that a lot of the words came in and out, and they're frequently borrowed from Chinese.
I think Korean and Japanese, to me, are two of the best languages of people trying to experiment in hip hop. Rap.
Oh, uh-huh.
To me, it sounds the best. I think they just have pretty big range of emotions in both the languages that just, as well as kind of like the consonants and the flow as you described it, fits well, I think, with hip hop and the style of rap.
Wow. That's something that I when you mention it now, though, I completely, there are, it's fairly prominent in both Japanese and Korean culture, and I hadn't really related it to the language itself. And maybe there are languages then in which hip hop doesn't sound as good, although I don't know, right? It's also interesting, perhaps, and historically relevant that both countries have this American influence, right? And that influx of American military occupation, military presence, maybe has a role to play, right?
It's very interesting that your classes are always packed. That's not true for all East Asian studies classes.
Right. Yeah.
Our major's pretty small. And so for your classes, one interesting way is the way they're titled and the way that they're described is I wanted to talk to you about the idea of like kind of using soft power in our own lives as Asian American men. because I mean, it's what I'm doing as well. Like I'm definitely marketing myself as not a Korean artist, but having Korean elements in my music, and I'm trying to fit in with that scene and sound of music, and hoping that helps increase like people's maybe respect or associate positive things with my music, so they give it a chance.
Mhm.
In the same way that the way that perhaps you describe your classes helps students take the chance on the class.
Right.
And you have a class where it's pretty diverse. It's a lot of students that are not just East Asian Studies majors, to say the least.
Yeah. In the past, it wasn't always the case that my courses were packed, but I did try to always capture students' interests. And so I think, definitely that soft power, I didn't think of it again as soft power, but I tended to try to think of courses or topics that students would, or typical American students would be interested in, hence samurai, hence Japanese food. And then it's something of a bait and switch. Although, we did study samurai, so it's not like I was, and the course description was accurate, I think, in my mind. So people did learn about them, but sometimes it's about destabilizing stereotypes about samurai or stereotypes about Japanese history, Japanese characters. And sometimes that doesn't really go over very well, but often I think people gain a more nuanced picture, right? And in the samurai class, we covered kamikaze pilots, for example, right? And I was actually quite shocked because I kind of thought everybody understood that they weren't voluntary necessarily, and that they were forced to do it. But a lot of American students had actually thought that they were like really crazy and that they kind of were eager to kill people or to go on these suicide missions. And they were in fact college students who were collectively grouped into this suicide mission without very many options.
Just to, I guess, bring it to a little bit to modern day and talk about something a little bit more sobering and trying to apply things that we've learned about in your classes, right? There's so much increased violence against Asian American people, especially in the States. And how do you interpret that? And how does it feel like it's pretty one-off, or does it seem all of a sudden to you, or does it feel more like a trend?
It's not a one-off at all, really, right? I think in some ways, Asia as the other has been the dominant narrative for much of American history, as you know, and as we learned, right? It just, the maybe what is different is that who gets targeted among Asian Americans or Asians changes, right? So initially with the gold rush, maybe, the Chinese Americans or Chinese were targeted. And then with World War II, Pearl Harbor's and tensions with Japan, it becomes Japanese Americans, and suddenly Chinese are your friends or American friends, right? And then in the 1980s, when I was actually growing up in the New York City suburbs, my father was working in New York City and he was stationed there and he was transferred there because of his job. And that, again, was even a reflection of Japanese growing economic power, right? He was in finance and therefore he was transferred to work in New York. And it was those years when the Japanese economy was doing really well, and they were buying things like Rockefeller Center. And there were, I think, on the one hand, there was some, I think, new respect, and also some interest in Japan. But there was also a lot of tensions, right? And maybe not so much in New York, but in Detroit, I know there were people who were destroying Japanese cars. I think there was a very famous incident where a Chinese American was targeted, I think, because people thought he was Japanese, and they, I think, killed him. And so there's always been those kinds of incidents. And so the fact that there's again, I think this time around, it's a little bit different maybe, in that Asian Americans have just generally all been targeted, and because that there's this perception that COVID is Asian and maybe especially Chinese Americans in China. But it's also, there's the new economic tensions that were combining with the COVID tensions, right? That has today made Chinese Americans and Chinese especially vulnerable, I think, to American violence and American bias, American prejudice against people of Asian ancestry. But it's not really all that surprising, and it's not that new to me. And I think the fact that Japan's economy has not been doing that great, and China's rise and Japanese new efforts to deploy soft power have allowed Japan to at least be a little bit less at the forefront of American anger and American bias. The collective American psychology can't really think about all different Asian countries at once, and seems to emphasize one as being especially the most threatening, right? And that one changes depending on the economic and the political context. But at least so far, it doesn't seem like that's going to change.
Since they started excluding based on race with Chinese people in 1882, it's racism to me only morphs, and they'll only praise us and call us things like model minority when it's convenient and it serves another purpose, which is which a lot of people know as to kind of put down Latinos and African American people. So it's not surprising this time, but it's just, it makes me want to check in with my loved ones, just because I have a lot of Asian friends and our family members are pretty high risk. I guess I wonder, what would you say? Where do we go from here? How do we try to flip or destabilize this narrative that Asians got the COVID, they're spreading it around, and hurting those people will somehow help me not catch COVID or help me have a release from my situation?
I just right off the bat, I'll say that I don't really have any solutions. And so it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of work, I think. I think COVID, if you look at the facts, it's now there's community transmission, and it's not like Asian people are bringing it to the United States anymore. There's really very little travel going back and forth anyway, right? And in fact, Asian countries have done a much better job controlling the virus now. So really, it's being transmitted among Americans, right? And I'm not saying that Asian Americans aren't part of the problem. We probably are, but it's just that it's not like I'm bringing the virus to your neighborhood or to you. The people who look other are deemed to be more of a threat, I think. And so at the end of the day, I guess, I also try to check myself a little bit. And I don't know if that's the right reaction or not, but I don't want to live in fear or live all the time, even when I'm grocery shopping, with this kind of, are they looking at me in a particular way because I'm Asian? Maybe I'm trying to develop a little bit more of this kind of on-off mode. And the way that I've tried to do good, so to speak, is through my teaching and having conversations in the classroom. But maybe when I'm off campus and when I'm not in my teaching role, I do have to let go a lot. To be real honest, I think I would be more comfortable in Japan because I'm part of the dominant majority, right? I mean, and I don't have, and Japan's fairly homogenous, and there's that this kind of tension doesn't exist there, right? But again, I do feel like leaving is not really a solution, and any culture, any society has problems. And so just maybe being active, being here, doing what I do is it's not maybe going to change the world. It's not going to change things overnight, but maybe that's just a very small contribution we can all make.
Yeah, you really touched on a lot of things there that I have been thinking about too. It's hard to not think about when you're Asian American and you're paying attention to the world and the way that people look at us, the way that, for me, I'm actually more of maybe a confrontational person, not like I'm going to try and fight someone on the street, but if someone stares at me, I'm gonna stare back equally hard, or ask them if they have a question. something. Maybe it's that young person in me that just doesn't want to stand for all of these microaggression type things. Especially, I remember flying back from Wesleyan right when the pandemic started, and I was one of the few masked people, and these white people were covering their faces up like without masks, like I was the threat to them.
Yeah.
And so I tried to exude some soft power or play off the stereotype, and I pretended to cough on the plane so I would get my own row. So
Yeah. Okay.
So
Yeah.
I think being in America is just a pretty hard, hilarious at times, just really deeply entrenched in race country. Our society, everything I feel like flows through people's understandings of race and the context that come with it. I find myself code switching quite a bit when I'm in a different setting to be safe or to be respected. So I think it's a set of baggage that I am quite tired of carrying. Similar to you, I think being in a place like Korea would be pretty refreshing, but at the same time, I also feel this burden. Like, wow, if I just go back, is that kind of like not even go back, go visit Korea? Would that be kind of hanging up the cape, or just kind of giving up on other Asian Americans who might not be as privileged to voice their opinions and be respected? So it's really a hard line to walk to me.
Yeah, maybe I was also young when I was younger, a little more confrontational, and that's fine. And maybe even today too, there are times when one should be confrontational, right? Or maybe there are times when you're using the bias for your own ends, like you did with the pretend coughing. And maybe so it's not like there's one way, right? And that there's also it's not also like, you can only do these extremes. Like there are ways that maybe you compromise and you try to negotiate a response.
I think the category of people of color, it's existed for quite a while now, but I think it's gonna gain relevance again soon, because there's been this intentional wedge to make Asian people separate somehow from this people of color group, this larger historically disenfranchised group, the out group. Now that there's been this clear discrimination against Asian American people, I wonder if there's going to be some shift in conversation between communities and the way that we understand our place in this country, that we're accepting this place, but that we can at least realize, oh, maybe I shouldn't be as prejudiced against people that are also discriminated. Maybe we can find some common ground and work to build our communities up again. Yeah. So even though it's a really, really hard time and I'm horrified by the violence, I also think it was always underneath the surface, just kind of waiting to outburst again, especially with having Trump in office for 4 years, really fanning that flame. I'm not surprised. And I think that it could have some positive outcomes in the end.
Yeah, definitely. Right. Maybe we do need to look at the positives, and all those sentiments were always there even before Trump. Right. So in the fact that maybe he just allowed it to be aired more by more people, and we finally all saw that it was all there. Right. But your also point about people of color and maybe how Asian Americans were not included. Also, again, maybe the violence against Asian Americans allows people to see that it's not that we're all actually we all have to confront these biases, this discrimination, right?
I wanted to just kind of get to your deep field of focus, as well as talk about your book that came out last year.
I examined this historical tale called The Tale of Flowering Fortunes. And previously it's been dismissed for being boring. And it's pretty tedious because there are a lot of names. And if you don't know the political background at the time, it's pretty hard to get through. So it hasn't really gotten a lot of respect. And conversely, as a history, it's also been dismissed because there's lots of problems with it. There's a lot of mistakes and stuff. This chronicle in the vernacular allowed people to heal, actually, right? And these so-called mistakes are mistakes, but they also show how people remembered and restructured and tried to process what happened in the past. And in some ways, it relates to what we've been talking about today about history. This work does try to make people empathize with former enemies or with people who died and try to reconcile different political factions at the court. And so, one of the things I'm interested in, and I tried to do in the book, although again, I don't have any clear answers for anybody, is how might we go about writing history or remembering the past that allows us to come together.
So the title is Flowering Tale, right?
Flowering Tales, yes.
Exercising.
Exercising. Yeah. History in Heian, Japan. And actually, the background of my Zoom virtual background today is the cover art for my book. And it's published by Harvard Asia Center last year.
It seemed like there's also quite a bit about feminism and female writers that contributed to this work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So at that period, in the Han period in Japan, Chinese was the official language, and men wrote in Chinese. So Japanese literature is actually a rare case in which women shaped the vernacular literature. They were writing in Japanese using kana, right? Using Japanese orthography. And history wasn't really understood to be something that women wrote about, right? They did write about their personal experiences. They wrote tales. So part of my work is to talk about how the rise of personal writings, diaries, and monogatari, these are fictional tales, allowed for the writing of history by women. So conversely, it was really this kind of new language of the vernacular of tales, of fiction, of personal writing that allowed women to write history for the first time.
On that note, I think it would be great to wrap it up. And thank you so much, Professor Watanabe, for coming on and closing out the season strong.
Yes, well, my pleasure. It was really great to talk with you.
Thanks for coming on. Thanks for listening to this episode of Tea with My Uncle Irohs. Catch us every Monday on your favorite podcasting service. TWMUI is written and produced by me. Definitely rate and review us on iTunes and follow me at Son of Paper on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. Theme music by Keys. For more, visit facebook.com/unlockedkeys. Spill with y'all next time on Tea with My Uncle Irohs.